MOMBASA Chess Championship, which is happening these 4 days, and we've seen amazing things so far. So this is already round 4, but in round 3 we saw a Ugandan star, Masiko Ezekiel, and against a Kenyan giant, Methu Joseph. So we see this guy from Uganda, Masiko. Masiko is one of the champions of the differently abled category, and he's a brilliant gentleman and very well composed. So we see this game that kicks off with the move d4 with Ezekiel Masiko with d4 from Uganda, and then Matthew from Kenya plays knight f6. Very standard. Of course, you expect c4. I know Masiko always plays c4. And then we see the move g6 on board. G6 comes in handy. Of course, we see at this point, this is the King's Indian, the knight, king knight variation. So we see knight f3 coming on board, and then, of course, bishop g7. Then we see this move, knight c3, and at this moment, we usually expect castling or d5, but then he goes with Methu. Methu goes with d6. Of course, it's pretty expected that nothing much is different here. These are standard setups. Bishop to g5, and then we see bishop kicked around, and then the bishop falls back. Of course, we see the bishop pushed around until we see this bishop attacked by the knight. Of course, this is known, and this bishop is taken out usually with by this knight, and then we see knight. Then we see a knight c6 on board. So we see the bishop coming out, and then the bishop is taken, and then the pawn takes back. H takes e3, and then we see the center being busted with the move e5. Of course, we expect taking, and of course we have options to take at this moment, whether with the knight, whether with the bishop, but of course also with the pawn. Of course, it takes with the knight, and we see Ezekiel going with the queen. Everything is still pretty standard, and nothing much is new at this point. Of course, we see b3 reinforcing the pawn on c4, and then we see the bishop attacking the queen, and of course Ezekiel pushes the pawn to block, and then the bishop falls back. Then we see the rook coming out, and we see pawn to c6, and then knight to d4, and then at this point, that's when we see g4 coming on board. Then we see a brilliant move from Ezekiel that he's going for that bishop, of course, with knight to f5, going for that bishop and putting some pressure on the king side already. Of course, he takes the knight, and then we see a pawn getting into the throat of black's position. Of course, that pawn is a bit overextended, but it seems fine at this moment. So there's nothing much we can still say about this game. Still in a drawish position, so we can still hold on as it is at this moment. So we see queen coming into f5, and then we see the move castling. Castling at this moment is timely, of course, getting off the strikes from the queen and some x-rays from the queen. Of course, we see castles from also black side. We see a fight being ready at this point, because the king has just gone on the other side, and then we see also the king has gone to this side. So we see the knight coming in, of course, going for that pawn, loose pawn, and then we see the bishop falling back. At this moment, we see the queens being maneuvered by Ezekiel, and then we see the pawn. I thought about him taking this pawn, but of course he didn't choose to take that pawn, and then he pushes away the queen first from that potential place, a nice spot, and then the queen falls back. Of course, we see him maneuvering. Of course, I think he has a better plan for this diagonal than the queen, trying to improve his queen. And then we see Matthew opening up this position with a d5. Of course, takes, and then we see this exchange in the center with rooks flying around, and then this pawn falls. Of course, these guys are all playing with fire. At this moment, this king and seems to be a little bit exposed, but everything still seems fine. And then we see this pin. This pin comes in timely. Of course, this is when Matthew starts to go off balance, and then we see the queen being attacked. Of course, then when the queen falls back, that's when we realize that things were not really okay. Matthew goes more inaccurately and then falls back with the queen. This pawn falls. This is the first pawn that falls, and things start to fall on the king side. This pawn taken, of course, when he takes, because we know that there is a checkmate pending there. So this is really a very deadly position with very deadly position for Matthew already. So he takes the queen, of course, and then he uses the pawn. He didn't use the rook. but then we see the rook attacking the bishop, and that's when we see things just going worse for Matthew when another pawn falls. Of course, this knight bishop is defended by the Matthew. Really, I believe, thought by attacking the knight would get back the bishop, and probably it was a miscalculation on Matthew's side. And then we see the knight coming in timely, going for the rook instead. Of course, bring back the rook. The bishop just comes. The pawns are fallen, and of course, right now, this is when we see that now Ezekiel just needs to convert such a game to come back into place. So we see the knight coming back, and then this is when the king just gets into play. The knight falling back doesn't help, because now this guy forces an exchange. Of course, when you refuse the exchange, things are just going more centralizing is just getting ahead. So we see the rooks being taken away, and then the knight comes in pretty right at the right time. So this knight falls in, and of course Ezekiel was planning all these strikes. Of course, this pawn falling, the king just gets closer, and then we see that these pawns are just getting more connected at this point. Of course, this pawn cannot be saved. Trying to save it, as Matthew did, was just pushing the pawns forward. Of course, this check doesn't help since the pawn is already defended. The king just moves around, and then if one pawn falls, of course, there are all these strikes, and at this moment, this is really lost for black. Nothing really helps at this point, and then we see that soon the knight is taken, and of course, the pawn is already getting to promotion squares. So this game was already lost for Matthew, unfortunately, because of that inaccuracy and in the middle game. So see you in the next round as the guys still hustle it out. Harold and the group from Uganda, and also other players from South Sudan, are still really fighting to stay in the top positions. See you tomorrow. Bye.